Dear friends, you have chosen to spend some time with us today. You're connecting from all over the world, and we at ICCJ welcome every single one of you. We are grateful for your presence with us. Welcome to this special event dedicated to commemorate the extraordinary trajectory of one man, Jules Izak, and of the Seelisberg Conference in 1947, a conference that took place in a devastated Europe. This conference was a watershed event in Jewish-Christian relations. At ICCJ, we consider the Seelisberg Conference as the birth of our organization. Our speaker is Dr. Norman Tobias. He's the author of The Jewish Conscience of the Church, Jules Izak, and the Second Vatican Council. The book was published first in 2017 in English, and soon after that, it was translated into French, La Conscience Juive de l'Église. It is an extraordinary biography that contains a myriad of facts. Dr. Tobias has studied a staggering amount of archives, documents, private correspondence. I myself have read the book several times, both in English and in French, and I feel that a lot still escapes me, which is why having the author with us is a very special treat. As we were preparing this, one sentiment emerged that resonated with the current situation. The life of Jules Izak was a quest for freedom, truth, and human dignity. This resonance is also why we have decided to maintain this event today, despite the war, and why this event feels so meaningful. Dr. Tobias will begin by situating Jules Izak for us. After his remarks, I will use my privilege as moderator and ask him a few questions, more specifically about the Seelisberg Conference. While we do this, feel free to write questions to him, to address your questions to him in the Q&A. We will look at them, and Dr. Tobias will answer as many as time allows after we have had our dialogue. Norman, the floor is yours.
Dear Jules, with your permission, Madam President, Madam General Secretary, in normal times, begins American historian Robert O. Paxton in his preface to the French edition of my book. In normal times, Jules Izak would probably have led a calm life of quiet accomplishment. An exemplary student, he became an agrégé d'histoire and taught in a succession of ever more prestigious lycées, culminating in Paris's Lycée Saint-Louis. The name of Jules Izak became familiar to every French person who reached the level of secondary schooling during the interwar period and beyond, as the co-author of the Mallet Izak, the Cours d'Histoire by Albert Mallet and Jules Izak. The epitome of the assimilated Jewish French citizen of the Third Republic, Izak considered that regime of secular democracy the culmination of human progress. Non-observant, and as he described himself, primarily a humanist, he considered service to the Republic the best fulfillment of his Jewish identity. His father and grandfather had served in the French army, his father as a career officer. Jules Izak reached the summit of that other great engine of assimilation, the French school system, when he was named Inspecteur Général de l'Instruction Publique by the Front Populaire government of 1936. But Jules Izak did not live in normal times. After June 1940, the Vichy French government and the Nazi occupiers of France struck him brutally and repeatedly. The first Statut des Juifs of 3 October 40 expelled him from his position in the French school system. In the days leading up to the adoption of La Loi portant Statut des Juifs, Izak wrote to Marshal Pétain, at that time both head of state and as president of the Council of Ministers, also a government leader. From time to time, I will be quoting Jules Izak in English translation, which is my own. I would respectfully remind you that I am the historian whom you at one time summoned to your office at Les Invalides, and to whom you kindly showed your esteem. We read in the newspapers yesterday, the cabinet continued looking at clarifying the status of Jews. With this simple phrase, I find myself instantly excluded from the French national community, and along with me, French to the marrow of my bones, so many others, from Bergson, who taught us all, down to the classes of 38 or 39, who have served France well with all their genius or all their blood. It is open to question whether Izak's correspondence was ever brought to Pétain's attention. But if Pétain read Izak's letter in October 1940, this is the breathtakingly prescient caution he would have seen in its closing paragraph. Whosoever understands Germany, the Nazi, his God, Hitler, is aware that there is not a chance to mollify, through successive concessions, the inexorable victor. A new sacrifice of Isaac will not appease this Moloch. At the supreme instant, I await with confidence the intervention, human or divine, to restrain the raised arm of the sacrificer. Izak's publisher Hachette commissioned a new series of history manuals to replace the Mallet Izak. As the Minister of National Education, Abel Bonnard was to write in Gringoire, 13 November 42, Il n'était pas admissible que l'histoire de France soit enseignée aux jeunes Français par un Izak. Worse was to come. In early October 43, Izak's daughter, son-in-law, and younger of their two sons, Jean-Claude, were arrested in a Gestapo raid on a resistance cell meeting in Vichy. Shortly thereafter, his wife was arrested in their clandestine lodgings, a hotel room in Riom, while Izak happened to be absent at the barbershop. Of those deported, only Jean-Claude returned after the war. At the end of 1940, suddenly unemployed under Vichy, Izak, together with his wife and Jean-Claude, had taken refuge in the unoccupied zone, at first with friends and then in a rented villa in Aix-en-Provence. There, he overcame the pain of his exclusion, characteristically, by throwing himself into intellectual activity. Somewhere in the first half of 42, he had begun to reread the New Testament in the Greek original in search of the historical roots of the anti-Semitism that was afflicting him. The study became more intensive after November 42, when the Germans occupied the southern zone, prompting the Izaks to seek refuge in the Protestant village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, where their elder son Daniel was teaching. On the eve of her deportation to Auschwitz, though she then knew it not, 27 October 43, Laure Izak had managed to send her husband a letter from the transit camp at Drancy in the Paris suburbs. Mon ami, garde-toi pour nous, aie confiance et finis ton œuvre que le monde attend. My friend, take care for us, be steadfast, and finish your work for which the world is waiting. Thereafter, Izak's communication to all open hearts of his discovery of the depth of the Jewish roots of the gospel message and of the depth of the Christian roots of anti-Semitism became a sacred cause. The resulting book, Jésus et Israël, was published in April 48. It was dedicated à ma femme, à ma fille, martyre, tuée par les Allemands, tuée simplement parce qu'elle s'appelait Izak. The work for which the world was waiting was the first sustained, wide-ranging, well-grounded, and passionately argued intellectual assault upon a nearly 2 millennia old anti-Judaic tradition. Two capital questions, both informed by an age-old contemptuous teaching regarding Jews and Judaism, were the lodestars that guided his research. What was my initial concern, he wrote? To know, as current Christian teaching would have it, as a living tradition teaches, if Jesus truly rejected Israel, the Jewish people as a whole, if he declared its fall, condemned and even damned it, conversely, if it were true that the Jewish people as a whole misjudged Jesus, refused to see in him the Messiah and Son of God, rejected, ridiculed, and crucified him, if Israel deserved nearly 2 millennia of a heinous stain as the deicide people. In asking whether it was scripturally true, in a non-fundamentalist sense, as Christianity had taught for nearly 2 millennia, that the Jewish people were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus and have since remained so, and as a consequence, they had forfeited their very relationship with God, or worse still, were the object of a divine curse, Izak had ventured into uncharted waters. What he discovered and denounced was, as he would put it, a custom more than a tradition, a custom made up of deep-seated prejudices and of the most odious habits of mind, heart, and tongue. Jésus et Israël opens with two forewords. The first is dated 1943, the year in which the manuscript began to take shape while the Izaks were in the Protestant Auvergne, still living under their own identities. Embedded in this first foreword is in Izak's intuited thesis that the taproot of anti-Semitism is religious in nature. 2 months after his book appeared in print, Izak would distill its essence into 60 seconds worth of opening remarks in a live radio broadcasted debate with leading Christian thinkers. A reading and rereading of the Gospels in 43-44, the hardest years of my life, led me to conclude that the received tradition regarding Jesus in relation to Israel and Israel in relation to Jesus, a tradition that in no way impacts upon Christian faith and doctrine, overreaches in many respects the New Testament text, and that this received tradition, taught for hundreds and hundreds of years by thousands and thousands of voices, was in Christendom the primal and permanent source of anti-Semitism, the powerful secular taproot upon which all the other varieties of anti-Semitism grafted themselves. It follows that only Christian teaching can seek to undo that which Christian teaching has done, and it seems to me that if it can, it should. Even the Gospels themselves were not immune from Izak's historical critical eye. In them, he noted a dissonance between Jesus's universalism on the one hand and a non-Christian, indeed anti-Christian polemical bias against the Jews on the other. If I am convinced of one thing, he wrote in Jésus Réel, it is that Jesus does not lend himself to any scholastic category, any. Exactly for this reason, when someone tries to persuade me that Jesus's universalism was not only not Jewish, but anti-Jewish, that it carried an exception, and that this exception was addressed to his own people, the Jewish people, the only one he knew, the only one he wanted to know, I have doubts. I asked to examine the texts. And examine the texts he did, aware that the redaction of the Gospels in their final form in the latter third of the first century had not occurred in a historical vacuum. It was in this period that a bitter divorce was underway between what had begun as a Jewish sectarian movement and its mother religion. That an ever-hardening Jewish unbelief in Jesus as Messiah was complicating the mission to the Gentiles, and that a nascent Christianity had emerged from the protective umbrella accorded by the Romans to the Jews, creating an impetus not to inflame, but rather to curry favor with the Romans. As Izak would put it in his twilight years, as an historian and one little given to theological speculation, I am well aware that theology by its very nature goes beyond history in a unique way. But it is also true that in all the great religions, theology has an intimate connection with history. Therefore, history has a right to hold theology accountable for the use the latter has made of the historical data at her disposal. History has a right to ask theology not to distort or misconstrue these data, and to remain conscientiously faithful to historical truth, insofar as the latter can be fairly ascertained and determined. It is true that theology goes beyond history, but only provided that theology respects history as its point of departure. This is not only its duty, but I venture to say, its sacred duty. In October 1949, Izak was persuaded to secure a brief audience with Pope Pius XII at Castel Gandolfo. The audience ended with the delivery to the Pope of the 10 points of Seelisberg, theses about which Pius XII professed ignorance. Is it possible that the Sacred Congregation of Right's decision in 55 to reinsert a silent prayer for the Jews on bended knee in the Reformed liturgy of Holy Week can be traced to this audience? Izak seemed to think so. I do not claim that my request was the cause of the decision taken in 1955 to restore the genuflection, he later recounted. However, the Pope must have retained a memory of it, because shortly after my audience, he made a speech in which he spoke of Israel in uncharacteristic terms. But it was Izak's unpublicized audience with Pope John XXIII on 13 June 1960 that was to have the most far-reaching reverberations. This papal audience occurred 1 week after the Pope's formal closure of the Vatican II agenda, an agenda that did not then include relations with the Jews and anti-Semitism. It was the encounter between two octogenarians, one Jewish, one Catholic, both of goodwill, that led to the reopening of the agenda to include questions concerning the Jews. The corroborating evidence takes the form of documented testimony of Monsignor Loris Capavilla, as he then was, personal secretary to John XXIII. This testimony consisted of a one-page recollection of the lengthy exchange between Capavilla and the Pope in the immediate aftermath of Izak's papal audience. In March 1966, not 5 full months following the promulgation of Nostra Aetate 4, Capavilla reduced his recollections to writing and delivered the document to Father Stepan Schmidt at the latter's request. Schmidt, personal secretary to Unity Secretariat President Augustin Cardinal Bea, never released copies to any third party, though he did allude to it in conversation with, among others, Father Thomas Stransky. The original of this memorandum lies buried in the Augustin Bea archives in Munich. A photocopy was placed in the Vatican secret, now Apostolic, archives, one document among hundreds of thousands pertaining to the Second Vatican Council. The full text of this memorandum in its Italian original and in English translation, or in French translation in the French edition of my book, is reproduced. The relevant section, second and fourth paragraphs read as follows. I remember very well that the Pope remained extremely impressed by that meeting, and he talked about it with me for a long time. He told me he would speak with Cardinal Tardini about it, and particularly with Monsignor Dell'Acqua. He also told me that he directed Izak to Cardinal Bea, in whom he trusted and had confidence. It is also true that until that day, it had not occurred to John the 23rd that the council had to deal also with the Jewish question and anti-Semitism. But from that day on, he was completely taken by it. It was necessary to clear the name of the church from the accusation of being aloof and concerned about baptized Jews only, as Izak seemed to insinuate, and then in pencil, and to proclaim once and for all, Christians do not have the right to interpret in the key of condemnation, his blood be upon us. The record is silent from mid-June 1960 until mid-September of that year. Bea took his annual summer retreat to reflect upon Izak's concerns. On 14 September, Bea requested an audience with the Pope, writing, I would particularly like to bring up the question of responsibility concerning relations between Jews and Catholics, on which I am frequently consulted. 4 days later, on 18 September, upon Bea's initiative and recommendation, according to Stransky, John the 23rd mandated that the Unity Secretariat facilitate the Jewish questions during the council preparations. As Gregory Baum, one of those who drafted the consular statement on the Jews, writes in his preface to the English edition of my book, Jules Izak grasped a universal principle when he recognized that religions evolve and reform themselves by the insights and the vitality of their own members, and that he, as an outsider, could have influence on Catholicism only if he initiated and participated in a reform movement within the church. And so he did, beginning with Seelisberg. When asked to put together a dossier for the first members of the Unity Secretariat subcommission struck to work up a first draft of a statement on the Jews, Stransky thought first of the 10 points of Seelisberg. I still find the best and clearest summary of the corrective to the anti-Jewish tendency is the Seelisberg list, Stransky recalled, and in hindsight, Vatican II's De Judaeus can be traced back to the 10 points. On the desks of each subcommission member tasked with questions concerning the Jews, Stransky placed a copy of the 10 points of Seelisberg. The 10 points can in turn be traced back to Jules Izak's 18 points, drawn up by Izak in May 1947 at the behest of the Seelisberg conference sponsors. The 18 points were based in turn on the 21 propositions, chapters, of Izak's book, Jésus et Israël, a book of which the world was still unaware in the summer of 1947. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tobias, dear Norman, for this situation of Jules Izak that opens up many questions that we can now start to examine a bit further. And I would like to begin a bit earlier in the trajectory of Jules Izak's life with Catholic thinker Charles Péguy, who is probably not known to part of our audience, but he was Jules Izak's dear friend and mentor in Jules Izak's youth. So can you tell us a bit about this relationship and how formative it was for Jules Izak.
Charles Péguy was one of France's most illustrious poets, editors, playwrights, essayists. Izak first encountered Jules Izak when he was but 14 years old. As a newly enrolled boarder, he had previously been a day student at Lycée La Canale, which would be akin to schools such as Phillips Academy or Exeter in America, which straddles the boundary between the southern Paris suburbs of Sceaux and Beauve-la-Reine. In his 14th year, he lost both his parents within 6 weeks of each other in September of 1891, and was placed as a boarder by his elderly brother-in-law, married to an older sister. And Charles Péguy, having received his baccalaureate, was in the first of what was supposed to be 2 years of structured preparation for application for admission to École Normale Supérieure. These are Izak's first impressions of Péguy, who was 5 years his senior at least. He gave the appearance of having arrived, by what trajectory one knew not, straight out of the French Christian Middle Ages, from the 13th century, unless it was the 15th, this younger brother and companion of Joan of Arc. During that academic year, 1891-92, I watched him frequently, observed him for long periods, without being aware, perhaps, proof that he had a certain striking presence, even for the child that I was, not so much by virtue of his reputation as the outstanding Cagneux, than by a continuous energy that emanated from his very being, imposing itself upon me and upon all. Fast forward 1897, Izak is 20, Péguy probably 25, and at École Normale, and already making a name for himself among the French intelligentsia. And Izak, without going into detail, had a pivotal meeting with Péguy in the Jardin de Luxembourg, 1897, and was admitted to the one of perhaps 20 at most into the compagnage of Péguy. This is how Izak remembers that day. The agreement was sealed, the commitment made by me. I can envision it as though it were yesterday, the very spot where, before we parted, I said to Péguy with a total conviction that was invigorating me, "You can count on me." It was at the exit of Luxembourg, opposite the old Odeon, at the corner of the Rue de Vaugirard and Rotreux. On that day, at that hour, it was as if I had received a sacrament. The imperative of spiritual integrity and social justice that in my eyes Péguy incarnated, and which would inform so nobly the first editions of the Cahiers de la Quinzaine, this imperative became mine. It took root in me with such force, at such a depth, that even today, on the eve of my 80 years, it remains alive as on that first day, despite the dissipated illusions, the lived experiences, the vanished hopes. And that spiritual integrity and social justice, those imperatives would include, would extend to a renewed brand of Catholicism at odds with the bourgeoisified Catholicism of the establishment, and would involve Péguy reaching back to the Roman Catechism prepared at the direction of the Council of Trent, in which essentially the council determined that that Jesus's death was caused by the universal transgression, the transgressions of all of us. And I think it's important here to read just two sentences of this Roman Catechism on point, which scrupulously follows the teaching of the Council of Trent, and since it was put together at an express resolution of the Council, is considered to be a pronouncement of the Magisterium. It was the peculiar privilege of the Redeemer to have died when he himself decreed to die, and to have died not so much by external violence as by internal assent. Not only his death, but also its time and place were ordained by him. That's sound Orthodox teaching. So that's a short summary, an adumbration of how Izak came to be drawn in and so influenced by Péguy, who was killed in 1914 on the eve of the Battle of the Marne at the age of no more than 41, but was kept alive, I feel certain, there was an ongoing dialogue within Jules Izak's psyche between himself and Charles Péguy for the remainder of Izak's life.
Thank you. Questions have started to come in, and in one question by Martin Steiner, who thanks you very much for your lecture. Martin has two questions, but I will ask one for now because it directly relates to what you just told us about Péguy. In Jésus en Israël, Izak quotes Léon Blois. Was he also a personal friend of Izak like Péguy?
I am not aware of whether Izak ever met Léon Blois, but he did have something to say about Blois' salvation comes from the Jews. And I'm going to see if I can quickly, I can't find it, but essentially what Izak had to say about Blois is that while he, who so influenced Jacques Maritain and raised the question of anti-Semitism to its spiritual plane, I guess, is that because of the way that Blois framed his prose, one had to be very vigilant about reading him. And he wasn't, Blois was not for the uninitiated, the masses, because they could misinterpret him.
Thank you. In the summer of 1947, Jésus en Israël had not yet been published. 1947 is the date of the Seelisberg conference, to which Jules Izak is invited to participate. So how did that happen? What is the inside story here?
Izak was a household name in France during the interwar period, not as a specialist in Christian-Jewish relations, but as a secular historian, the author of the Manuel d'Histoire.
Mm.
The crises that afflicted him during the war, his ouster from civic society, his loss of his wife and daughter and son-in-law, caused him to inquire about the root causes of the anti-Semitism that was afflicting him and his family. And he began working on the manuscript for Jésus et Israël in 43, really. But nobody was aware of it. Very few people. His wife was aware of it, his children. He had not finished the manuscript. He was still working on the fourth part, the final part, post-war. And he was based in Aix-en-Provence, almost in seclusion. The best evidence we have that in summer of 46, he had not yet emerged into the public sphere as a specialist in Christian-Jewish relations is that he was nowhere to be found among the 150 participants at Oxford in the conference organized that occurred in midsummer 46 with the aim whose aim was to redefine relations between Christians and Jews in a more positive manner and address specifically anti-Semitism. Izak was nowhere to be found there. And for good reason. He'd not yet emerged in that sphere. However, in February of 46, while he was still writing the fourth part of his book, he happened upon the 17th edition of Daniel Rops's Jésus en son temps. Daniel Rops was a Catholic philosopher. He happened upon this 17th edition in a bookstore in Aix. And essentially, Daniel Rops, this is post-Holocaust, echoed a tradition that was hundreds of years old, nearly 2 millennia old, purported to stated effectively that an explanation of the Holocaust, the destruction of European Jewry, an explanation could be found in Matthew 27:25. Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be upon us and on our children." And Daniel Rops continued, and this is the line that set Izak off. And Daniel Rops actually this is not his. He lifted it from an anonymous Jewish author, but without acknowledgement. Perhaps it was necessary for Israel to kill their God, whom they failed to recognize. But since blood mysteriously invokes blood, does it not perhaps belong to the charity of Christians to let the horrors of pogroms compensate in the hidden balance of the divine intention for the unbearable horrors of the crucifixion? Izak wrote Daniel Rops, the same Daniel Rops, by the way, who had sent Izak not one but 2 condolence notes on the death of his wife and daughter. He wrote a letter to Daniel Rops, wrote several drafts, but finally mailed it on Easter Sunday of 1946, and it excoriated Daniel Rops how can I explain what I felt in reading such turns of phrases, sagely balanced, perfidious in their form, deliberately abstruse? I find in them a sacrilegious stench. They express I don't know what secret satisfaction and a most odious perception of divine justice. I don't hold Christianity responsible, far from it, but you, a certain Christian Pharisaism that you do not have the courage to repudiate. You who are perpetuating a murderous tradition, yes, murderous, I will tell you straight up, it leads to Auschwitz. You speak of Jewish responsibilities, the time has come to speak of Christian responsibilities, or that of pseudo-Christians. The Jewish people are nothing but a metaphor for humanity in its entirety. Peggy, this Peggy who you apparently as little understood as you do the Gospels. Peggy said, it is not the Jews who crucified Jesus Christ, but the sins of all of us. The Jews, who were but the instrument, participate like others in the font of salvation. This is how a true Christian speaks. It was Peggy who brought us together. It is Peggy who today splits us apart. Izak waited for a response. None was forthcoming. And so he decided to publish his letter. Not out of animosity toward Daniel Rops, Izak later explained, but for two reasons. The first was the risk that the resounding success of the 17th edition of Jésus en son temps would affect and intoxicate its readers by the tens, by the hundreds, by the thousands. The second was the nature of my critique, which showed the work of reducing to a soft mass, of deforming, of a tendentious selection of scriptural passages, trends in Christian literature. Daniel Rops did not have a monopoly. Emmanuel Mounier, then editor of Esprit, refused to publish. Vercourt, writer Jean Brulé, whose Silence de la Mer was the first major novel published underground during the occupation, editor of Europe, agreed to publish. And by the way, when it comes to Esprit, the editor of Esprit, the current editor, published a review of the French edition of my book in March of 2020, 2 years ago, and in it is a mea culpa. On behalf of Esprit. Izak's letter was published in the July 46 issue of Europe, and that was how Izak came to the attention of certain French intelligentsia, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish. Remember, Izak was still secluded in Aix through the end of 46 and into the first 2 months of 47. He only submitted the manuscript on February 28th of 47 to his publisher, Albin Michel. It was in March and April of 47 that what had begun as some correspondence and supportive letters from members of the intelligentsia began to gain traction. He would meet them in Paris, which is where he would be in March and April. And that's when, in mid-March, he received a letter from one of the two executive secretaries of the ICCJ, inviting him to submit something for the Seelisberg conference. And that was followed up by a meeting on April 15th when Izak underwent surgery. He was hospitalized from March 29th until April 14th. The day after he was released, he met again with the ICCJ executive secretary, who invited him to participate in the conference and asked him to prepare a memoir, which, and in particular, points of rectification. And it was in mid-May that he returned to Aix-en-Provence to draft these 18 points and the memoir that would be translated into English and distributed to Seelisberg conference participants. So we can thank Daniel Rops. That's the irony. We can thank Catholic philosopher Daniel Rops for Izak's presence and role, pivotal role at Seelisberg.
Pivotal role indeed. In your opinion, what made Izak resonate with Christians, and what occasioned resistance to his thesis? And also, do you know if Izak had any resonance with Jews?
In terms of his resonance with Christians, and I'm looking for Gregory Baum's. I asked Gregory Baum, who was overwhelmed by here it is, by so overwhelmed as a doctoral student at Fribourg in Switzerland, newly minted doctor of theology, that he so overwhelmed by Jésus et Israël that he published a partial rebuttal of it, the Jews in the Gospel. He wrote the manuscript in 57, 58, the first edition published in 61. But I asked him, and of course he was also one of those who drafted the consular statement. He was one of the first, one of the original members of the subcommission tasked with drafting a consular statement on the Jews. He had already been appointed by John the 23rd as a peritus, an expert advisor for the Unity Secretariat. And when Augustin Bea, in mid-November, I think it was, at the first meeting of the Unity Secretariat in 1960, sprung upon all of the members that this new agenda item, because nobody was aware of it, questions concerning the Jews. During a coffee break, Gregory Baum, he was only then about 30, he approached Augustin Bea, who was chairing the commission, and he alerted him that by virtue of his research and publications, he had some knowledge in this area. And that's how he came to be appointed as a subcommission member. In correspondence to me dated December 15 of 2014, Gregory Baum wrote the following: why was I overwhelmed by Jésus et Israël and not other writings? A preliminary reply. 1. The book is written by a Jew who survived in hiding, whose family had been murdered. 2. It is not written as a scholarly work, but as a manifesto addressing Christians and their churches. 3. Despite the anti-Jewish bias throughout Christian history, Jules Izak is not resentful, but turns to Christian friends to start a movement of reconciliation. 4. His book shows that Izak has great admiration for Jesus. Conclusion, he speaks as a man with authority. I would say these first reactions by Baum are representative of how and why Izak struck such a chord among Christians.
And among Jews, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, there were efforts on the part of some Jewish intelligentsia, André Nuer, Emmanuel Levinas, to claim Izak for the Jewish people, Izak never disclosed his own personal spirituality. I think the fact that he was I think that helped him in terms of his the response he elicited from Christians in terms of provocation to reform their teaching about Jews and Judaism more in line with Scripture and doctrine. At his death, his sons again reaffirmed that because of, I think it might have been in part occasioned by an article published by André Neuer on his death that purported to suggest that Izak, well, the fact is that Izak was born Jewish and he died Jewish. And by his own request, Jewish funeral service, buried in a Jewish cemetery next to his parents. I think the farthest we can go, or the farthest that any Jewish thinker has gone, was in private correspondence to Izak dated 6 February 1961 from Emmanuel Levinas, the French philosopher. I can never get through this. I'll try. Will your writing persuade Catholics? Your writing provokes discomfort and anxiety among them, for it is authoritative. But as for us, Jews, we recognize not only rigorously grounded argument, but also a humanity most noble, that is to say, a Judaism. We also feel from you, dare we mention it, a heart most vigilant and tender, and a memory that forgets nothing. And this feeling is more important to us than metaphysical propositions, orthodox or heterodox, that memory transcends. This is the reason why your existence in this century is confirmation of our truth.
You got through it. You see, I had opened the book at the same quote, but I was going to help you, but you got through it. At the Seelisberg conference, what was the composition of Commission 3, the one that was named the task of the churches? And what about the Jewish participants in that commission? And do we know who the draftspersons were of the 10 points?
In terms of the Seelisberg conference, Izak himself had lamented that there was no representation from either the French Catholic or French Protestant churches. He writes, as a Frenchman, it seemed a shame that the French churches, Catholic and Protestant, were not represented. Could this have been the result of the conference organizers having aimed too high, extending invitations to the likes of Cardinal Saliège, Pastor Bonnier, Ambassador Maritain, academicien Etienne Gibson, each of whom for one reason or another was unable to make the trip to Seelisberg and did not send replacements in his stead. So the French contingent consisted of one Catholic, Marie-Madeleine Davy, lecturer at l'École des Hautes Études, where she was pursuing graduate study in Jewish philosophy of the Middle Ages, no Protestant, and one rabbi, I'm talking French contingent, the Grand Rabbin Jacob Kaplan, and Jules Izak. That was the French contingent. In terms of the Commission 3, the task of the churches, there were, it was supposed to have been chaired by Père Marie Benoit, who was very helpful in procuring baptismal certificates and and places of hiding for Jews during the first years of the war. He was most 41, 42. But because Marie Benoit was ill, it was Père Calice Lopino, a Rome-based Capuchin, who chaired the commission. In terms of the Jewish composition, I think there were four. There was Jules Izak and Grand Rabbi Jacob Kaplan. There was Rabbi Rosenblum from New York City, and there was Rabbi Tzvi Chaim Taubes, who I think hailed from a Hasidic dynasty, living in Switzerland, and whose son, Jacob Kaplan, I believe, was on the faculty for a number of years post-war at, I think in the 50s or 60s at Columbia University in New York City. In terms of, and what transpired very quickly was that the 18 points that were drawn up by Izak of rectification concerning Jews and Judaism, which were drawn from his 21 propositions chapters of a book which had not yet been published. Those 18 points at the first meeting of Commission 3 were tabled not by Izak, but by Rabbi Kaplan. Why not by Izak? Because Izak happened to be ill that day and was unable to attend the first Commission 3 meeting. Kaplan tabled the 18 points in the hope that they would be adopted as framed. The Jewish membership recused themselves ultimately, while the Christian membership of Commission 3 then transformed those 18 into 9 or 10. Jules Izak actually makes reference to 9 points in very early correspondence following that Congress, which makes me wonder whether in fact there were initially 9 and then a 10th was added, and then which one was that. But Izak, in personal correspondence to Father Fadilovsky, a Protestant dialogue partner of his in France, is that he could confirm that the two draftspersons of the 10 points were, ironically, both Jewish converts to Catholicism, Father Paul Deman and Father Jean de Benasque.
Okay. And we do know, however, that the 10 points of Seelisberg bear Jules Izak's imprint.
Oh, there's no question. All but 2 of them have easily identifiable counterparts in among Izak's 18 points. The 2 that don't are point 4, which talks about the scriptural love thy neighbor, the ahavta es re'echa kamocha, and point 7, which to which I made reference earlier in relation to Izak and Peggy, point 7, which is really theological in nature, but it seems to me you can actually draw a straight line from Charles Péguy through Jules Izak to point 7. Point 7, or at least part of point 7, provides in part it is not the Jews alone who are responsible for the cross which saves us all, reveals that it is for the sins of us all that Christ died. I think in my view, you can draw a straight line from Péguy, dredging that Roman catechist, recalling, reminding Christians, and also obviously Izak, because reminding them of that sound doctrine, orthodox doctrine, through Izak to point 7.
And now from the 10 points of Seelisberg to the conciliar statement, how did that happen?
Well, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, Stransky, who was the first as a young Paulist priest, he was only 30 at the time. He was so persuaded that the 10 points had a role to play for the commission members that he taped a copy of the 10 points on the desks of each of the subcommission members. Gregory Baum reproduced as an appendix to his partial rebuttal of Jésus Israel, published in 61, in German, the German rendition of the 10 points. Gregory Baum, in his preface to the English language edition of my book, writes, we paid attention to the writings of Jules, the 10 points of Seelisberg, and the studies produced by the above-mentioned reform movement. Their insights, overlooked or discarded in the past, now became the cornerstone of the church's teaching. I mean, Baum was one of those who drafted the conciliar statement. He's there in black and white.
What had the official church history been prior to the unearthing from the Vatican secret archives of the testimony of Monsignor Capovilla, Pope John XXIII's personal secretary that you mentioned in your...
Yes. That, by the way, just before I tell you what in terms of how I came about, I knew of the existence. I knew of the existence of that document, and I flew to Jerusalem in October of 2007, toward the beginning of the research, archival research, and met with Father Tom Stransky, who was a tantour at the time, and asked him for a copy, because he had purported in a footnote to Vatican II, to a contribution to Vatican II by those who were there, he had represented in a footnote that he'd been given a copy by Stefan Schmidt. Well, in fact, he had not. He did not have a copy. All we had was hearsay. But it happened that in June of 2015, in March of 2015, on Erev Pesach, which happened to be Good Friday, I met with Stransky in New York City at the Church of the Apostle Paul. We had a good 2-hour meeting, and I delivered a copy of my dissertation, which had just been defended. 2 months later, I was in DC at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, participating with 19 other scholars in a 1-week seminar on Jewish-Christian relations. And Stransky invited me to lunch at the College of St. Paul in DC. I think it's on the grounds of Catholic University. And there I went. And at the end of lunch, he pulled out a thin file and he said, "I have something for you. This is June of 2015. And I opened it, and he was watching me as I opened it. And it was a typewritten in Italian 1-page document. I knew what it was, even though I couldn't understand the Italian. And I said, how did you get this? And he said, John Borelli, special advisor to the president of Georgetown on interreligious matters, had gone to Rome to do some research at the Vatican Secret Archives. Stransky remembered it as as in the summer of 2014, although Borelli's diary says it was January 2015 when he went. And keep in mind, it's June of 2015 now. And Stransky said, I gave him a box number. And he looked in the box number, 1540. He found the document, copied it in his own hand. Because of its importance, I suppose he didn't want to ask that it be photocopied, and took it with him. It was translated in Bologna and in DC, and it's reproduced in the vernacular and in the Italian original in my book, in both French and English editions, contrary to literary convention, lest anyone within the church or assert that I took liberties with the translation. What had been the official church history before this was stated by John Osterreicher, another of those who drafted the consular statement and a Jewish convert to Catholicism. In the Vorgrimler edited commentary on the documents of Vatican II, and essentially the prehistory of and how the fourth article of Nostra Aetate came to be, and Osterreicher would write more than once at various junctures that Jules Izak's visit had a lasting effect on John the 23rd cannot, in my opinion, be doubted. On the other hand, it is questionable whether his was the decisive influence in moving the Pope to act as is sometimes asserted. What he did, however, was to cause the Pope's intention, until then but vaguely formed, to mature. Now I want you to contrast that with Loris Capovilla's documented testimony of his exchange with John the 23rd in the immediate aftermath of that pivotal, unpublicized papal audience on 13 June 1960, and I quote, "It is also true that until that day, it had not occurred to John the 23rd that the council had to deal also with the Jewish question and anti-Semitism. But from that day on, he was completely taken by it."
Yes. So we must all be very grateful to Jules Izak, and grateful, I guess, to you for unearthing all these documents. This was my last question to you. I would invite our participants, if you would like to ask another question, now is the time. And we are not in the habit of recommending books at ICCJ, but I would definitely recommend everybody to read this book, The Jewish Conscience of the Church, in English or in French, because we have heard a lot of information with you, Norman. There is so much more in the book, and I know there is so much more in you, but that will be for another time, I guess. If there are no other questions, and I don't see any, we've had a lot of comments thanking you. There is, okay. Phil Cunningham, what would you say are the major theological differences between the 10 points of Seelisberg and Nostra Aetate? Norman, do you feel you can answer? We have another 7 minutes left, or?
Philip always asks difficult questions.
Yes, somebody has to.
Yes. The major theological differences Philip is asking, but as between, yes. In other words, was there evolution?
Between the 10 points and Nostra Aetate.
Well, the 10 points with the exception of point 7 and perhaps point 4, which are theological in nature, we're really more reminding Christians about scriptural truth and how a tradition more secular than inspired had overreached the boundaries of that scriptural truth for nearly 2 millennia. The fourth article of Nostra Aetate was entirely theological in nature. It was a daring pronouncement, the first really to define the relationship between the church and the Jews, the Jewish people, and addressed to Catholics. So those would be my first reactions, Philip. I know that if we were together in person, you would press me on this and there would be follow-up questions.
Yeah, but that's okay. I would moderate that session, so I'm sure we would find a way out of this. We do have one question from Rochelle Rabinovitz, but I know what the answer is. I will ask it anyhow. What motivated you to do this research, Rochelle asks. Did I miss this at the beginning of your introduction? No, Rochelle, you didn't miss, but I will let
Okay.
Norman.
Okay. I will hazard a guess, a speculation on my part as to part of what drove me. Though really this is more about Izak than it's really more about Izak. My earliest memories of liturgy were Catholic, not Jewish. I was between the ages of 4 and 8 in Montreal. We had a nanny, Solange Nadeau, who was a devout Catholic. She came from a farm in Rivière-du-Loup. Many of her uncles and aunts were religious. And unbeknownst to my parents, she would take me to Mass at l'Oratoire Saint-Joseph. We were only a few minutes away, which sits atop the sanctuary that sits on top of the mountain in Montreal. So my earliest memories of sense, of music, were Catholic. Solange also gave me something that I wasn't receiving at the time, I suppose, from my mother. So I think a psychoanalytic explanation might be that I was driven to try and put my Jewish and Catholic mothers together.
Okay, thank you. That's very personal. I think we have learned tonight that the respect of history is a sacred duty. Thank you very much, Norman, for sharing all your knowledge with us. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, ICCJ General Secretary Annette Adelman, for doing what you do to make this happen. I would just like to make one brief announcement. The commemoration of Seelisberg at 75 will continue with paired current reflections written by authors that showcase the diversity of ICCJ. They will arrive in your email box every 2 weeks, provided that you have subscribed to the ICCJ newsletter. So if you have not, please do so, and you will receive these wonderful reflections. And one last thing, on our website, on the ICCJ website, you will see a donate button. Please don't hesitate to click on donate. We need your help. We do have a couple of more remarks. I'm going to read them quickly. I'm enormously grateful to Norman for all his work. When I began to learn about Jules Izak, I happened upon his PhD thesis and subsequently acquired his book. Thank you so much for this invaluable scholarship and enabling me and others to discover the vital contribution that Jules Izak has made to Christian Jewish understanding. Thank you for this evening's talk. Congratulations. Kol hakavod, David Arnold, Manchester, England. And from dear Carlos, in 2009, the ICCJ and its member organizations resolved to renew their engagement with the 10 points of Seelisberg that inspired their beginnings. And as the result, a time for recommitment called for the following document was prepared, the 12 points of Berlin. How do you feel about the importance of this document as a true recommitment to the 10 points of Seelisberg? That is a question for another conference, Carlos, but there will be, at the end of this Seelisberg celebration, there will be another webinar and a workshop, and we will address this. And there is another message by Karma Ben Yochanan. Thank you for a wonderful and fascinating evening. Thank you very much. I think that with this, we will end this webinar. Norman, we are in your debt, extremely grateful for you spending this time, dedicating so much time to preparing this and spending this time with us tonight. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you all soon again in person or on a screen for another webinar. Thank you.